You are listening to episode 47 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Carol Horton joins us to speak about the practice of yoga and mindfulness, their relationship with one another, and their embodiment in the realm of social justice. Why do you practice mindfulness or related disciplines like yoga? Is it to clear the mind, get a little relief from stress, or maybe as a medical intervention in the treatment of an illness exacerbated by stress? Or perhaps you have more traditional motivations to your practice, defining mindfulness within a larger religious framework, and you're seeking enlightenment. Whatever your reasons may be, you might notice a shifting in how you relate to others, to yourself, and how you are in the world. There are wider implications than strictly personal development goals, and our guest is here to help us unpack some of the potential social ramifications to practice. Carol Horton, PhD, is a writer, educator, and activist working at the intersection of mindful yoga, social science, and social justice. A certified Forest yoga teacher, Carol trained with Anna Forrest, an internationally recognized pioneer in yoga for psychological and emotional healing. She has taught yoga in several studios, as well as a jail, homeless shelter, community health center, and residential foster care facility. Currently, Carol serves as a teacher with Yoga for Recovery, a Chicago nonprofit offering classes to women in Cook County Jail, and at Chaturanga Holistic Fitness in Chicago. Dedicated to yoga service and outreach, Carol serves on the board of the Yoga Service Council and was a co-founder of Chicago's Socially Engaged Yoga Network. A former political science professor, Carol holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and is the author of Race and the Making of American Liberalism, published in 2005 by Oxford University Press. She has extensive experience as a social research consultant and has written numerous reports for nationally recognized foundations, nonprofits, and public agencies. Since 2013, she has served as a program development consultant for yoga service organizations, including the Fairer Foundation, Chaturanga Seeds, and Yoga for Recovery. Our guest today is Carol Horton. Carol, welcome to the podcast. Glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to have you. And let's dive right into just what your background is, how you came to have a yoga practice.
Well, I came to yoga in a very mundane way, like a lot of Americans. I just thought it would be a nice way to add in some stretching to my workout routine. And that was really honestly it. I started my first weekly yoga class in a church basement in St. Paul, Minnesota, when I was a junior faculty member at McAllister College, teaching political science. And slowly over time, it just started to grow into something that became more and more meaningful to me, though I didn't really know why. It just kind of called me, and gradually I found that I shifted more and more of the time I had in my schedule for exercising to yoga. And over time, I gradually went, I moved. So I took classes at gyms, and I eventually went from gyms to yoga studios, and I eventually got interested in yoga philosophy. But really, it all happened very organically because I just started having deep experiences in the course of yoga that I didn't expect. So I got very interested in trying to figure out what was going on with this. Why was something that I had originally assumed was just, some nice exercise and stretching. That's it. No big deal. Why was I having experiences that were profound with, emotional breakthroughs and kind of visions and just some really profound stuff starting to happen. So I actually ended up eventually writing a book about this, which answered a lot of my questions in terms of thinking into what am I doing as a contemporary yoga practitioner? Where did this come from? Why is it taking off so much right now? It's all my reflections on that and my story, my personal story, are in my book, Yoga PhD, Integrating the Life of the Mind and the Wisdom of the Body, is the subtitle. And, the title Yoga PhD, it was sort of a joke for me because to me, as a trained academic, it seems so incongruous that I would ever get so into yoga because I was socialized heavily into being purely in my brain, the life of the mind. I went to the University of Chicago for my PhD, and that is a heavily, heavily, heavily intellectual place, not big on things like yoga and spiritual practice. So it's been a big journey for me to integrate my yoga experience into the rest of my life, but it's one that continues to be fascinating and fruitful, and I just love it.
Thank you for that background. And for folks who are listening, that book, as well as at least one of your other books, 21st Century Yoga, will also be linked on the episode page for this episode, so be sure to check that out. People will be able to just click and it'll take them right to Amazon for those. And it's interesting as you were speaking how easily we could just switch the word yoga for meditation, and the people who have come to this practice of some form of awareness, whether it's in a spiritual way or just as part of their daily habits, those experiences are very much the same, very similar at least, and how that journey of, I just started doing this because I was kind of curious about it, and it just showed me some things that I wasn't expecting, I think is fairly common.
Yeah, I think it's very common in the yoga world, and I'm less directly familiar with the meditation and mindfulness communities. I certainly have gone to various sorts of shorter retreats and trainings that have focused exclusively on seated meditation and so on, but I know yoga culture much more intimately. That's where I've put in most of my time, and then I do a lot of reading about meditation, mindfulness, and contemporary Buddhism. So I definitely see a lot of parallels, although I think that what's distinctive about yoga, or what we call yoga today, is the exercise component. And so many people like me think of it as exercise or stretching, and that really cast a wide net in terms of who might decide to try it. I remember actually I interviewed Sharon Salzberg once, and she told me that I was kind of like, what do you think about yoga? Because we always feel a little maybe inferior, I think, because in the yoga world, seated meditation is seen as sort of the next step and kind of better, or at least I think a lot of people feel that way. I have my own thoughts on that. And she said she's really happy that yoga seems to have brought so many people to meditation, and that she's met countless people who really got interested in Buddhist practice first because they, like me, started out doing yoga as exercise, and then that led them into that. So I think there's a lot of connections. So
you have a great article, and what led to us having this conversation on the Yoga Service Council, called Yoga, Mindfulness, and Social Justice, The Time Is Now. And folks who are listening, I'll be linking that on the episode page. And I'm wondering what prompted you to write that. What's the story that led you to write this one as a blogger?
Well, there's the short story and the long story. The short story is that I was asked to write a post for the Yoga Service Council because we just had our 4th annual conference last week at the Omega Institute. and I served as a faculty member at the conference. I'm also a new board member with the Yoga Service Council, and all the faculty members were asked to write a blog to help promote the conference, basically. And so my key event I led at the Yoga Service Council conference was a panel discussion where the broad topic was yoga and social justice. But I thought that that was so abstract that it would be better to work with people who are at least working with some broadly defined substantive issue or set of issues. So what we ended up doing was focusing on what's called the school to prison pipeline, because we do have a lot of individuals and organizations connected with the Yoga Service Council who do things like teach yoga and mindfulness in prisons, jails, low-income schools, juvenile detention centers. We also had a police officer who was part of the faculty this year. So it's a nexus of issues which are complex in the educational and criminal justice system that a lot of our work ties into. So on that panel, I had just 4 incredible people who all work on teaching yoga and mindfulness in a low-income school, in a juvenile detention center. These are the different people. One former prison inmate who learned yoga in prison and now teaches in the community he originally grew up in, which is a very low-income Black community in Chicago. All that's on the background on these people and so on is all on the site. It would take me a while to explain all their credentials. It's Leslie Booker, Argos Gonzalez, Marshawn Feltus, and Chanley Kuhn, just incredible people. So we had a panel discussion about that and really thought into, from the levels from the individual, both the teacher and student, the relationship between teacher and student, the communities that we're a part of as teachers and students, the institutions that people are working in terms of jails, et cetera, the policies and laws that contribute to that, working in as a classroom teacher, and then the ideas around what we're doing. So I was really trying to kind of nest all those different levels of analysis into concretely the work people are doing at different levels, and then how their yoga and mindfulness practices and their teaching of those practices matters in terms of our concerns about social justice. So that actually isn't a very short answer. That was sort of a long answer, but the longer answer behind that long answer is that I had mentioned I had started my first weekly yoga class when I was working as a political science professor, and so my background in that field was working on issues of race, class, and inequality in the United States. And after I left academia, I did a lot of work in the nonprofit sector as a researcher, also focused on issues impacting low-income families and children. So part of my personal practice, I suppose, is this self-integration I described in the Yoga PhD book, that I've always had these interests in social justice. I have a lot of background in terms of thinking about race and class issues and their intersection, in particular in the United States. So for me, bringing that into the yoga and mindfulness worlds is just really a personal passion. And also it is just sort of an organic part of my own personal evolution. It's just who I happen to be and where I've been interested in these issues, pretty much my whole life.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing both the long and short form of the story.
Kind of reverse themselves.
And I think it's something in the water, because this is a passion that I share, and folks on my other podcast are well aware. I'm very cognizant and supportive of increasing and appropriate diversity within our communities of meditative inquiry. And also I'm originally from Chicago and have the Minneapolis connection as well. So it's something in the water here that we care about that. So tell us, how do you see yoga and potentially mindfulness, what you're familiar with that on that, as perhaps contributing in some way to social issues? Can they potentiate action?
Well, first, just as a little bracket before I answer that, I think for me, just to clarify terms, when we say yoga today, we're really talking about asana practice or posture practice in particular. But yoga, if it's going to be more than exercise, when we do those postural practices, it has to have a mindfulness dimension. And it also has to involve conscious work with the breath. So it's really that integration of mind, movement, and breath, I think, that makes what we call yoga today really powerful for people. But of course, the yoga tradition is much bigger. So for me, when I say yoga, mindfulness is necessarily part of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean sitting meditation exclusively. So in terms of how yoga and mindfulness then could contribute to social issues and social awareness, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think there's a number of levels. So first, I think it's easier, like I had mentioned before, to kind of think of the social, the interpersonal, the community, the institutional, the social and cultural separately, but also how they connect with each other. So first, as individual practitioners, I think if we care about these issues, we start learning about whatever happens to be the particular set of issues that calls to us, whether it's environmental sustainability or racial justice or whatever it might be. I've found, as somebody who worked, as I mentioned, in academia on these issues and in the policy sector, the more that I learn about the issues, the more I see how complex they are and how difficult it is to really leverage the sort of change that I'd like to leverage. So knowing more is often discouraging, but it's necessary, because if we don't know what we're talking about, then we're ineffective and easily lapse into sort of simplistic ideologies, which can be really unnecessarily divisive in my view. So I think it's important to have knowledge. I think it's very hard not to have negative emotional reactions come up. I mean, it's natural to feel a range of things. I mean, my big ones are overwhelm, and I feel overwhelmed by it. And like, I can't, what could I possibly do? Someone else might have more of an anger reaction, which I think is healthy when you learn about something like mass incarceration or something that I talked about on the panel. There's a lot going on where we should be angry about it. But I think as yoga and mindfulness practitioners, we have the tools to work with those difficult emotions and channel them in positive, productive directions, first and foremost for ourselves. So we need to be able to practice in a way that if we get angry, what's beneath that anger? Beneath that anger is a love of justice, to connect to that love and have the anger energy turn into a commitment to see where we can take action. Underneath that overwhelm is a sense of grief, sense of love for the planet, which I see being destroyed. So I think when we dig deeper, which we can do through practice, we learn how to deal with those emotions as they come up, learn to sit with them, see what's underneath them, then we get to that deeper level. And usually at that deeper level, there's a really strong love, I think. If we connect into that love, then we can move out into the world, into relationship with other people, into our social justice work in a way that is not simply replicating the very many negative and destructive patterns that are out there, but is actually changing them. So that's one thing, I think, is working with the difficult emotions. Similarly, on the individual level and the learning, I think that yoga and mindfulness practices on the level of personal practice can help us let go of our need for certainty and right answers. So as a political scientist, I really was passionate about, I'm going to find the right answers to these questions. How can we improve this or that happened? Really big questions about racial justice and so on. And again, it was really discouraging because I found even when you have what seem like maybe the right answers to you, the question then becomes, well, how would you ever in the world implement that? And there are never any easy answers to that one. So we have to have a willingness to move forward without right answers, and the practices can open up a space of possibility and the use of our imaginations and of flexibility to respond with love to whatever is happening in the present moment. That's a fruit of practice. And then the third one I would also say is that really being willing to let go of the results, which kind of is connected to feeling like we need the answer. We also feel, again, understandably, that if we're concerned about social justice, we want a certain outcome. We want things to change. Otherwise, why would we engage. We want concrete change in the world. But the fact of the matter is, again, if you study history, as I have extensively about social justice issues, even when activists manage to achieve some very big goal that they were working towards, inevitably what happens is new problems and challenges come up. It's inevitable always. So we have to be engaged in the process of activism as a practice. It's a really difficult balancing act because you need to know where you want to go, but you need to have some sort of provisional answers and provisional goals, but not get so cathected to them that you get into this reactive spin cycle again and sucked back into all those emotions of frustration and overwhelm and anger, which will always come up. And if we play them out, it just carries through the negative spin cycle that's already so well in place. So that's all on the individual level. Then, we enter into the practice of conscious relationship with others. So how do we show up to teach yoga and mindfulness in ways that really embody social justice, where we are not, sailing in to save the unfortunate or be on some sort of unconscious self-aggrandizing ego trip for ourselves, but we are really entering into mutually transformative relationships with people as equal beings. And we really see our opportunity to teach as a huge privilege that we have, and are humbled by that and grateful, and are always willing to learn from our students. That is transformative for them and for us. Then I think we think about different professionals in different settings. For example, Argos Gonzalez, who's a teacher at an alternative high school in the Bronx, who was on my panels at the Yoga Service Council conference, talked about how these kind of individual practices and relational practices I'm mentioning really helped him be a better teacher. He had studied a whole social justice pedagogy, and he trains actually other teachers to teach with a commitment to social justice. But he said that without the mindfulness practice, it was very difficult for him to manifest that in the classroom as well as he could otherwise, because he didn't have the tools to deal with all of the problems and difficulties that come up when you're teaching, teenagers from challenging neighborhoods, lots of family issues, school administrators, underfunding. I mean, the whole thing, there's so much to handle and process and hold, that he talked about very eloquently how his work as a teacher, a high school teacher, not a mindfulness teacher, but his work as a high school English teacher could be so much more effective when he incorporated mindfulness in. And he's training other high school teachers to do the same thing. And I think we can think about, how would that work for social workers? How would that work for police? How would that work for people in the criminal justice system? So there's that level of integrating it into people's professional work. I think we also see a lot of opportunity coming up with the research being done about how yoga and mindfulness practices can help with healing trauma and recovery from addiction. And getting those tools out into communities that are really hard hit, in particular by trauma and by substance abuse, would be hugely empowering and help build up those communities. And again, hopefully, if there's other resources that are needed in terms of job training, for example, if they are all able to manage ourselves and our relationships better, then whatever we channel that energy towards will be more fruitful. And then I think going out to the level of the other professionals, lawyers and so on, I think, there's so many difficult issues that need to be really thoughtfully discussed and thought through, which are so emotionally laden, that practicing be able to mindfully discuss, say, policy changes or, political divisions without blowing up at each other and assuming that we're here to learn a common commitment to managing oneself, but also allowing space for the fact that people will inevitably have challenging emotions to deal with, having the maturity and groundedness to hold space for that. I think we could have more professionals engaged in that, more people from all different work environments engaged in that would help. And then finally, I think at the level of the culture, these practices offer a real corrective to our increasingly sort of socially Darwinistic political culture in the United States, where so many people are given the message through many ways through the society that if you can't sort of compete and win, quote unquote, and be the person who, sort of grabs the gold ring and gets the top job and makes the most money or whatever, then you're a loser and you're not a valuable person. And, I think there's so much struggling to have a sense of self-worth in our society and self-love that part of that comes from the fact that we tend to view people in such instrumental terms. We tend to view life in such materialistic terms that having a commitment to working regularly with a practice that shows you, doesn't just tell you, but actually shows you the ability of human beings to continually renew themselves and connect to something deeper within themselves that's a resource for a really life-affirming, positive relationship with themselves. And then once that's in place with others, that everybody has that ability. It really flips, I think, that script in terms of how we think about ourselves as human beings back to a much more small d democratic place, which we have really gotten away from. So I think that, there's potential on all levels, from the individual to the interpersonal to the community to the institutional to the social and cultural. But it's a process that I think is going to have to happen very organically, and that means that it's going to be messy and unpredictable.
You bring up so many rich topics for us to go through, and I particularly like the way you had this progression of representation that does start with the individual and just that base awareness, and then grows from there, and how it sends out tendrils of impact. It sends out waves as that pebble drops. And the thing that I wanted to segue into for a bit is one of the things you mentioned about not being particularly attached to the outcomes. And that may seem very strange to folks in Western culture but we have goals. We have things that we measure. We have to be concerned about that. And that segues a bit into a question I wanted to ask about kind of where that line is. Where do we cross from being socially engaged and prompting positive growth and meaningful material shifts in society? When do we cross that line into telling people what they must believe in? And here's the foregone conclusion that you must have, or you're somehow bad or deficient or not good. Where does that line? You've been thinking about this yourself. What have you come up with?
What I've come up with for me personally is that whatever sort of social justice oriented work or writing I do, I really do ultimately have to think of it as a spiritual practice, as part of my yoga practice. And I think the reason is that there's a way in which otherwise, for me personally, I just kind of know too much about all of the problems that are out there and how insoluble they seem, that it would be hard for me to have any rational reason to engage with them anymore, unless I saw it as a spiritual practice. So that's a different answer to your question, because it's really based more on kind of where I'm at. And I'm still at the point where I can say that, but it doesn't sound quite as strange to my own ears as I used to. But again, I was trained to be a very rationalist, kind of materialist thinker. And yet I've just seen too much in terms of the unexpected dead ends that the most well-intentioned political movements have hit, and the ways in which the revolutionaries become the oppressors so often. I mean, it's such a tragic and well-known pattern if you study political history. I was just in Central Europe for a family vacation last summer, and it was just wrenching to really, go to all these sites where and read about the experience of people who first had been overrun by the Nazis, and then, they survived and became Marxist, and they, were then overrun by the Soviets. And, the level of disillusionment from having thought that Marxism, Leninism would really be the right, antidote to fascism. A lot of those people didn't survive it. It just broke their spirits. Some of them, I'm talking about activists, committed suicide. And it's really heartbreaking. And there's so many cases where this happens. The French Revolution, classic example. So, this to me is just kind of the human predicament. I think that it's natural for us to gravitate towards wanting right answers, but right answer, you see it in religion and politics. The problem is that right answers often become final solutions, and it's a very dangerous terrain to be on. So, someone told me once when I was way back when I was starting yoga practice, who was way further ahead of me in the whole thing, how spiritual practice is always walking the razor's edge, that it never, like you're just never there where it's not sort of a danger of falling off into something like, ego aggrandizement or, whatever, spiritual bypass. I mean, there's just so many things. It's constant daily having to come back to the basics. Yet the basics become more and more the advanced, and I think it's bringing the politics in it becomes, to me, it just has to be bound up in that. And I think knowing some history of that appeals to you can help. But I mean, that's not the way most people tend to learn. Most people tend to learn through experience, personal experience. So I think that just really looking at what happens when people get overly attached to their answer as being the right answer, and when does that passion for pursuing a goal that probably should be pursued, let's say, because it's trying to correct an injustice and so on, slides over that edge into tyranny and demonizing people who don't agree with you and, having to win at all costs. That's human. Human nature is sort of a old-fashioned term with a lot of baggage, but it's the dynamic of being human that those dangers will always, always, always be there. And so I think it's very difficult, and I think we shouldn't expect it not to happen. But I think the more that we have people who really have a commitment to yoga and mindfulness and other, there's other paths, of course, there's many other spiritual practices and paths, but some sort of regular practice that keeps us rooted in the basics of love, really, and respect for others and for the planet, then we just have to keep making mistakes and asking for forgiveness and going forward. But I do feel that the fact that there will be division and there will be conflict and there will be negative emotions to deal with should not stop us from engaging if we care about social environmental issues today. I think we need to engage anyway. There are certain inspirational examples we can look to. I mean, I was very impacted growing up by the legacy of the civil rights movement. I think that informs a lot of the vision I have. And that was rooted in a Christian practice of love and forgiveness. And it can be done. It's just super difficult. But I think people are hungry for something positive today that goes beyond just taking care of myself. Because just taking care of myself today, it's so, all you have to do is check in a little bit on the news, and it's going to be clear that that's not going to be sufficient to offer a livable world for our children, the next generation, and so on and so forth. It's just not.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the demonizing of people who disagree with you. Some of the things that I've noticed online and conversations you and I have been on, there's also through, I think, an innocent ignorance, I've seen a little bit of demonizing people who actually do agree with one another, because there's a template of an ideological conclusion, and the individuals being demonized don't fit that. They fit into a different category that's the seen as the oppressor in this structure, and undeservedly so in these circumstances. So there's always this, perhaps a bias towards knowing what's best and wanting the easy button, having an answer ready, and maybe leaning a bit more into our discomfort with not knowing, with being okay with the chaos and the randomness that is an inherent part of life, so that we can keep open doors to creativity in the moment, instead of having, it must be signed, sealed, and delivered this. That might not always be so, because it is complicated.
I think that there's two levels of problems that I see going on in those discussions you mentioned, which are, one, the sort of ideological legacy we have as people who are concerned with issues of social equality. So it's a sort of left of center, long-standing set of problems. If you don't care about inequality, or you think inequality is a good thing in terms of social position and economics, then it's a whole different side of the political spectrum. But if you're on that left of center side, which is really the space that we're talking about, there's been conflicts between more left and more liberal paradigms that, for hundreds of years, I guess. And, more recently, I think we're inheriting the conflicts that came out of the cultural shifts of the 60s, the new social movements, the identity politics that really took off in the 80s, the way that Marxism evolved and kind of threaded through that to turn into more of a cultural politics than an economic, materialist sort of politics, which is very odd, but that really came out of the 1960s with the way that class has been sort of removed from the equation in a lot of American political debate. It's become more about identity. There's a lot of history that I think it feeds in, but what ends up is that we have these paradigms, which in my mind are all, in terms of the political paradigms, all bankrupt at this point. And I think that the liberal paradigm, you see a lot of hostility toward it from the left because of the blind spots that have never been corrected. So when it becomes, say, the easiest thing is more sort of color blindness. We don't see these differences because we're all the same. And it might be well-intentioned, but it's like, well, that's deliberate not seeing, it's deliberate lack of social awareness. And that's sort of the easy one. But there's also things that are a little more subtle, like, or maybe not quite such easy targets, like liberals want, reason, civil discourse, so we can all talk about things and room for different positions. But then are we really allowing room for the person who's upset and angry to really speak, or shutting them down, or for the person who's not conversant in a certain sort of professionalized language? And so then it becomes a kind of class-based barrier. And is the access that's supposedly there really there? And I think liberalism, which is this kind of taken for granted set of rules in some circles in terms of how you're supposed to behave, is often people react against it because it's holding itself up as inclusive and universal and equal and so on. But then people see incorrectly how it's really not. And to the extent that liberals aren't willing to make shifts so that there really can be inclusion, and people who maybe come at things differently or present differently or speak differently or something are really being heard, then the liberals aren't living up to, their free marketplace of ideas rhetoric, and it becomes very hypocritical and people just want to trash it. So that's been going on a long time. And then I think from the left, there's been this holding on to a kind of Marxist-based paradigm of, I don't want to go into too much detail, but, there was this idea that the proletariat was the vanguard. There was going to be this vanguard class that could overthrow capitalism and usher in an era of, like profound social justice, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And this, came up in the 19th century, and it has a lot of kind of Christian, Judeo-Christian, I think, visions built into it in terms of sort of revolutionary transformation. It has a lot of ideas about sort of a savior class that aren't really unpacked. So there's always sort of a look for the new vanguard. It's no longer the proletariat. It's somebody else, but it's not really assumed, there's not really a knowledge about where this came from historically. Why is there this belief that there's this certain class that kind of people that's going to kind of hold the key to like change the whole system? There's a whole tradition of talking about capitalism in a very monolithic way, like it's just sort of this singular thing that you can just like flip the page and get rid of it, and then this new utopian society will grow up. And I mean, that is really not a view that's based in reality. I mean, there's very many different types of market-based systems. There's very many different types of, government planning and regulation. There's very many different ways of mixing markets and regulation. And, and I think Americans also, to the extent this is a US-based discussion, we're really impoverished just by how bad our two-party system is. So we don't really have, we don't know what social democracy is, for example. So I would identify more as a European social democrat because I really believe in a mix of a market-based system and government regulation and a certain amount of planning and strong labor movement and so on. But I mean, most Americans don't even know such a thing exists. So it becomes polarized between this kind of unregulated free market, pure and simple, which actually also never exists because the government is always passing laws and making the money, monetary system work and build it, I mean, it's just a fantasy, but there's that libertarian, you don't need government except for police and military fantasy. And then there's this kind of left fantasy of, you can just get rid of capitalism and the utopian society will spring up automatically, which is, I think, a kind of romantic holdover of this evolving Marxist trajectory we've had for quite a long time now. But there's not really a there anymore. And, liberalism has become just sort of this piecemeal, like, let's not rock the boat, sort of everything's okay enough as it. I mean, none of it's working. So I think that personally, I feel like the way we could have better solutions to some of our issues would be new coalitions that really disrupt these stagnant, dead-end political paradigms we've inherited from the past. That we need like a realignment so that people who are now quote-unquote conservatives or quote-unquote liberals or quote-unquote leftists, if they could see that we all care about X and then just think about, okay, we really don't know how to get to X. We have all these different ideas, but the world's really complicated now. And like, how could we possibly get there if there were more agreement on just how to get to something that's more specific than overthrowing capitalism, which is way too vague. Like, how do we end mass incarceration? How could we change the drug laws? How would we do that? Could we provide more job training? How would we do that? And yet tie it to a bigger vision. So it's not just this kind of piecemeal policy thing. Again, that kind of small d democratic vision of everyone has inherent worth and potential and ability to connect to something deep in themselves, which we all share, which is what makes life valuable and meaningful, connected to that bigger vision and really kind of break up these stagnant political choices we have. They're just going nowhere. But I think, people are very attached to them. And so I think that's a very difficult thing to have happen. And probably it will only happen, this is my sort of doomsday side, when there's some big, huge crisis that makes people, react to what's happening right now because they have no choice because the crisis is so big. Anything else has to be thrown out the window, then things will change. But hopefully we can be a little more proactive, but that's usually what it takes.
I think you're right. That's one of the challenges we face is just our own natural lack of inclination to go into what is difficult and complex in order to make change for a later time that is not immediate. And I'm wondering what you see as maybe some of the other hurdles we face with making change in society and how yoga and mindfulness, whether you think of them as one or as two separate things. And I see them as very intimately connected, if not the same. What are some of the hurdles? How might yoga, mindfulness help with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's so many hurdles to making the change we need that again, for me, the first step with yoga and mindfulness is just renewing my energy and commitment to even want to bother, to try and engage with some of this stuff and to think kind of where I am realistically with my time, with my resources, with my abilities, talents, or whatever, what can I actually do? I think if we all really asked ourselves that question seriously, and if everybody who practiced yoga and mindfulness, and of course it's growing all the time, was encouraged to really think concretely, how can I join with others who share whatever I'm drawn towards? So, for example, joining with the Yoga Service Council, we're much more effective as an organization than we would be as isolated individuals. We share a common agenda in terms of teaching and learning and bringing out a certain sort of message and building a certain sort of community. And there's many other similar groups doing that work out there. And then, as an organization or as a social network of people with these interests, how do we then bring this to the next level that we can? And people are starting from all different places. I think, there's a lot of controversy now about, say, the, Silicon Valley embrace of mindfulness, the corporate world's embrace of mindfulness, and so on. And my view would be, rather than sort of either embracing it as, what I see is a lot of polarization between either it's uncritically embraced, like anyone who does mindfulness is going to be a better person and the world will change, it'll all improve because it's sort of magic, which, there's, again, so many counterexamples that's just obviously not true. But then there's also this denunciation of it shouldn't be there. That's, it's just sort of reinforcing the status quo. It's just becomes a tool for oppression and so on. Again, the people who are in that world, I'm not really in that corporate world at all. I think it's quite right to push them to start thinking about, okay, if, it's part of your practice, are you really looking at where you are right now? How are you engaging with others in your company in the world, the tech sector, in the broader social sector? What's happening in San Francisco? Are you doing whatever you can to be good stewards of the city? What is the, lowest wage rate that's being paid? Can you raise it to at least $15 an hour? Join the fight for 15. Can you bring down executive pay levels to a reasonable place? All these kind of questions, asking those questions, thinking, well, what could we do? And, committing to taking whatever next step is actually available as part of a yoga and mindfulness practice. It's penetrated society enough that if everyone were doing that in a sincere way, presumably we would find new options, and presumably we would generate new momentum in terms of getting a handle on, we have so many problems to tackle: inequality, environmental devastation, racial injustice, rotten educational system, rotting infrastructure. But it's just this country, and just like start about talking about the Middle East or, Europe, Africa, everywhere has enormous problems, right? So this kind of middle ground between self-help and feeling good as an individual and sort of opting out of thinking about society, and, that being one side, we've had a lot of that. And then the other side being sort of this really highly charged, political warrior type, is very kind of ideological and not really connected to concrete practice, concrete policy issues, concrete organization, concrete, how are you helping the fight for 15? Like, connect to something real, and then when you get into that, based on what you can connect to, connect with others. And that's really all we can do. And I think my approach is more pragmatic and piecemeal, and not really the single grand vision for comprehensive political transformation to a perfectly just, environmentally healthy world, because I don't think that's possible. I think all we can do is really commit to making it part of our practice to have the inner resources to bring to the world in a way where every day we try to take the next step, starting where we are, to really leverage changes that, there are a lot of things that most people should be able to agree on if we could talk about them reasonably, in terms of a lot of people want pretty much the same basic thing. We want physical safety. We want good education for our kids. We want, decent place to live. Even if you look at polls, there are majorities of Americans big majorities who agree to a lot of these kind of stock, might call them progressive goals. But we're so divided, and movement forward towards them is so difficult that we feel overwhelmed and hopeless. So I think using the practices to battle that overwhelm and hopelessness, coming at it from a kind of spiritual practice perspective, and then really using the concrete tools to take next steps from wherever we are is what we should do.
Manageable bites, manageable bites. Our guest today has been Carol Horton. You can find out more about Carol and her work on her website, carolhortonphd.com, which will be linked on the episode page for this episode. Carol, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.